this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are Zooming in from. I see some familiar faces out in the audience. I just want to really just thank everyone for joining us today for this conversation. My name is Elizabeth Klein. I am the Director of Advocacy and Policy at Remake. We are an advocacy organization fighting for fair pay and jobs with dignity in the clothing industry. And I am really excited to be here with our allies in this work, the Garment Workers Center and Workers United. Can everybody just make sure to put yourself on mute? Thank you. Both of these organizations were closely involved in the development of the Fabric Act, which is what we are here to talk about today. This exciting new piece of legislation was just introduced in Congress last week by United States Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. The Fabric Act stands for Fashioning Accountability and Building Real Institutional Change. And the bill is the first in the modern era introduced at the federal level that is really aimed at systemic reform in the clothing industry. So it proposes kind of a two-prong approach to do this. It has groundbreaking new workplace protections for garment workers, alongside a $40 million grant program and reshoring tax incentive to grow modern, high-tech, responsible domestic apparel production. The Fabric Act, which we're going to talk more about, it builds on the historic California Garment Worker Protection Act, which passed in September of last year and went into effect just this past January. So it's truly incredible to see this cause picked up so quickly by our elected leaders at the federal level. It might come as a surprise to some of you that there are nearly 100,000 garment workers in the United States, several thousand garment factories, and they operate everywhere from California to New York. We were just in a beautiful garment factory on Friday in the Garment District in New York for our manufacturing, to Texas and the Carolinas and beyond. The US makes apparel products ranging from luxury handbags, runway fashion, to boutique slow fashion, t-shirts, jeans, bathing suits, fast fashion, and of course, PPE, which was crafted throughout the pandemic and that kept us safe. And what these manufacturers will tell you is they want to keep making clothes here in the United States. And really for too long, they felt that the industry has not been properly invested in and it's not really been given attention, and that offshoring was considered an inevitability. So the Fabric Act aims to give these factories the resources they need to thrive and to really accelerate the reshoring boom that we've seen during COVID-19. But the bill also gives garment workers the protections they need to earn fair pay and lead lives of dignity. Garment workers in the United States, which we're going to talk more about today, they are often underpaid, overworked, and put in unsafe conditions. In fact, in the US, garment workers face the second highest rate of wage theft of any group of workers. And this not only threatens the reputation of made in USA products, it creates an uneven playing field for responsible manufacturers and brands who are serving the now $5 billion global market in sustainable and ethical apparel. And so to those ends, the Fabric Act introduces a prohibition on predatory payment by piece rate compensation schemes. So that means when factories are using the piece rate to underpay garment workers, and it sets the minimum wage as the floor. And it also introduces new liability requirements that ensure that brands are allies to their manufacturing partners. And before we get started with this conversation, I want to point out that the US is not just an innovator when it comes to manufacturing. We are a nation that has historically pioneered strong labor laws and workplace protections that end up impacting policy on a global level. Just as the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 really revolutionized workplace protections more than 80 years ago, we really believe that the Fabric Act proposes, precedent-setting changes. And so now we're going to get going in the conversation. I'm going to introduce our other panelists that are here with us today. And then we're going to leave time at the end of the conversation for press to ask questions. So what I would do is just ask you to drop those questions in the chat. And then later on in the conversation, I'll read your questions to our panelists for a response. So we have with us here today, Edgar Romney, Secretary Treasurer of Workers United SEIU. Thank you for being here. We also have Daisy Gonzalez, I believe you're the head organizer of the Garment Worker Center. The Garment Worker Center were the co-authors of California's SB 62 and a developer of the Fabric Act. And we have Francisco Zul with us as well. He is an LA garment worker and a member of the Garment Worker Center, and he was a fierce champion for the California Garment Worker Protection Act. So Daisy, I want to start the conversation with you. Thank you for being here. So the Fabric Act, as I've mentioned a few times, it was inspired by the California Garment Worker Protection Act. Why was SB 62 such a watershed moment, and how has it led to the development of the Fabric Act? Just unmute yourself, thanks.
Forgot to unmute. Hi, everyone. I'm actually the organizing director at the Garment Worker Center, and I was privileged to be able to work with the garment workers that helped to spearhead SB 62. And SB 62 was so important because it truly was a worker-led campaign. We, heard directly from workers about what the issues were in their factories, and you'll hear in a few minutes directly from one of our members of the types of wage theft that occurs in 2022 in factories that are producing brands that are well known and worn every day throughout the United States, throughout the world. So because of that wage theft, the egregious working conditions, this movement came about, and SB 62 is really what inspired the Fabric Act. And I also think, it's worth mentioning that SB 62 and now the Fabric Act, it's so important because it's inspiring conversations about accountability, right? Throughout the world, really. And, because of the just terrible working conditions that we see in the fashion industry to this day, these types of policies are just incredibly important.
Thank you, Daisy. And, one thing that we have been asked a lot is just, a little bit about the process of how this came to be. And to Senator Gillibrand's credit and her office's credit, they came to us even before we had won the California bill, and they said, how would you feel about taking this to the federal level? What does this look like to keep going? I remember at the time we said, let us win in California, and then we'll see how we feel about the next steps. But it really was the membership, Garment Worker Center membership, who felt like it was important for the bill to impact laws on a federal level. And Edgar, I'm wondering what else you can tell us about, the process of creating and creating the bill and garnering support. And in particular, it has widespread labor support. So what do you think that means for, labor policy more broadly?
First, Liz, let me thank you and for putting this together, because I obviously think that it's a very, very important subject and something that me and my union have been dealing for a number of years. It has been a systemic problem with this industry, probably ever since it got started at the turn of the century, ever since we began to make garments in this country. The dynamics have changed and things are considerably different today than they were, many, many years ago. But it's always been a problem where manufacturers and retailers, and now what we call brands, have taken advantage of contractors. Many, many years ago, when the industry first started, people who made garments actually owned the source of production, they sold it, they did everything, okay? And at some point in time, that dynamic changed and they started to use suppliers, which we used to call contractors, all right? And ever since then, it's been a major, major problem in terms of those workers, okay, being taken abused of, not only by their own direct employer, but the brands who supply that work to them as well. So it's been a very, very difficult situation. I'm very, very pleased to see, that this change has come about. I also must say that the concept is not new. For many, many years, and certainly here in New York City in the apparel industry, okay, in the union environment, we've always had the brands and manufacturers take responsibility for the workers, the work that they have in their contracting shops. All right, it's called the Jobbers Agreement, which holds the jobbers and manufacturers actually responsible. So for the work that is actually produced in their behalf, so that if contractors don't pay their workers or there are other issues, the union was actually able to hold the manufacturer responsible for that. And that is something that has been, we've been dealing with for a long time. In terms of the bill itself and labor support, I think labor's going to really fall behind this bill because it's not only because of the importance of it, because it has taken so long. This is not the first time that any group or legislators have attempted to do something. There's also something happening in the New York State legislature, also to supplement this kind of work. But I think that the time is right. Hopefully we'll be able to get enough co-sponsors and actually get it through Congress to make it the law of the land.
Thank you so much. And I do want to add that in addition to strong labor support already from the AFL-CIO, SEIU, RWDSU, Workers United, we already have strong industry support and civil society support. And this is really similar to what we saw with SB 62. And I think the reason is that they really view the bill as a way to level the playing field for responsible manufacturing. And many people in the industry, what I hear, are tired of being undercut by the players who aren't playing by the rules and who are exploiting fashion's essential workforce to compete. So Francisco, I want to turn it over to you. A lot of the press doesn't often get to hear directly from garment workers in the United States about their experiences. I'm wondering if you can just talk to us about what kinds of experiences you've had working in the garment industry with wages and working conditions prior to the passage of SB 62.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. And I'm going to let Daisy to help me with this because I would like to answer. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Daisy for her help to repeat this question for me in Spanish because I would like to answer this question in Spanish for you guys.
Sí, la pregunta es, ¿qué tipo de experiencias has tenido tú en la industria de la costura en términos de los salarios y las condiciones de trabajo?
Yo vengo de un país del tercer mundo. Soy originalmente de Guatemala y también trabajé como trabajador de la costura por muchos años, tanto en mi país como en México. Y aquí también he trabajado ya muchos años. Pero lo que nunca me imaginé es que en la ciudad de Los Ángeles iba a experimentar algo igual o peor que en mi país de origen.
To translate, Francisco said, I'm originally from what we call a third world country, Guatemala, and I was a garment worker there as well as in the United States now for many years. And I never imagined in Los Angeles that I would experience the same working conditions, if not worse, in the United States.
Desafortunadamente las experiencias como trabajador de la costura han sido muy malas. No solamente en el aspecto de la forma de cómo pagan, porque yo he estado trabajando por muchos años en lo que le dicen como pago por pieza y a veces me ha tocado, bueno, yo he estado trabajando básicamente toda la semana, algunos días pues también a los 6 días a la semana de 7 a 7, ganando un salario muy bajo de $350, $400, trabajando 60 a 62 horas a la semana.
Unfortunately, I've had to endure terrible conditions, including with pay. I've had to work for many years under the piece rate system. I've had experiences where I worked a full week, 6 days a week from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. with a low salary of $300 to $400, and that's for 60 to 60. ¿Algo más para compartir, Francisco?
Sí, cómo no. Que me entró un sonido aquí bien raro. Sí, también quiero agregar de que el problema no es solamente el asunto de los salarios, sino también la forma de cómo la gente son maltratados. Desafortunadamente, los dueños, de fábricas y especialmente las personas que dirigen en las fábricas, como los managers, no tienen preparación y no saben cómo tratar a las personas y te tienen como una máquina más, como un robot que está trabajando y sin consideraciones. Y también trabajamos en edificios en muy malas condiciones, en donde yo personalmente tengo pruebas de que en esos edificios están en malas condiciones, donde incluso hay ratas, hay cucarachas, de los cuales pues tenemos que eh, básicamente compartir con eso. Algunos edificios están en tan malas condiciones en donde no tenemos aire acondicionado, en donde en el verano es prácticamente como en un infierno trabajar, porque hay edificios en donde hay pequeñas factorías en donde tienen una pequeña ventana y es todo lo que tienen, y no tenemos ventilación.
I also want to add that the problem is not just the salary, but also the treatment of employees. A lot of times, employers and managers don't treat their workers well. They really treat workers as robots without consideration for the person. The buildings are also in bad condition. They are plagued with rats and roaches. And in the summer, there's no ventilation, there's no air conditioning, and so we're working in extreme heat. Gracias, Francisco.
Okay.
Gracias. Edgar, I want to turn it back over to you. You know, you have long battled exploitative working conditions in the garment industry, but I do want to point out that there are unionized factories in the U.S. There are factories that pay minimum wage. There are factories that pay above minimum wage. Why is this bill important for those actors? Why is this relevant for really the entire industry, including the ones that are playing by the rules, if you will?
Elizabeth, I think the bill really sets a tone how this industry ought to operate and how to function. For many years, brands have been able to exploit workers and actually exploit the suppliers that they give the work to. Many of them over the years would give work to suppliers based upon consignment, which means basically they would only get paid if the garments that they actually produce sold in a store. Another methodology that they had used over the years, that they would agree on one price, and when it came time to pay, the price changed for any number of reasons. The delivery was late. The style, something was wrong, with the actual production of the garment. So brands have found ways over the years really to circumvent, how this would work. One of the things that are exciting about this bill, I think it does a number of things. One of the main things that does is allow workers it holds the brands responsible, and the workers will have joint liability requirements, in which fashions brands will be held responsible for the work that they put, in their suppliers. So that workers now, for the first time, certainly in a non-union environment, will have an opportunity, and there'll be some remedy for them to do something about it, which had not existed certainly in the past. So I think that that's a key thing. And that also applies to union shops as well, because we always don't know what happens, all right? And, workers don't tell us what's going on for fear of retaliation, so they'll have another avenue, quite frankly. So I think that it's important to them. But I really think what's important is that the culture is changing in this industry, not only here in the United States, but certainly on the international level as well.
Thank you. And so, let's turn back to SB 62 for a minute, because this really kind of paints a picture of what might happen on the federal level if the Fabric Act were to pass. So I want to go back to Daisy, and then Francisco, I want to hear what you have to say about this as well. You know, the SB 62 went into effect in January. It's very recent, but what can you tell us about the impact of SB 62 and what that might portend for what would happen if the Fabric Act were to pass on the federal level?
Sure. So this, SB 62 has been in effect since January 1st, and we've been very excited to hear from our membership that things have changed in some factories. They are not being paid by the piece rate anymore. They are seeing minimum wage, and but I also think that it's important to note that it's very early in the process, and we are still seeing some factories that are refusing to comply, right? And that's why we've been very focused on the enforcement component of this bill, and working very closely with the State Labor Commissioner's office. Most recently, we did joint outreach in the industry to make sure that workers and employers knew that this bill is in effect, what the components are, what can you do if your rights are still not being respected, right, as a worker. And I think that close collaboration is going to be really useful to make sure that we see more compliance with this bill. And yeah, I just think it's also just a little early to tell, right? We're still doing some surveying of our membership, and trying to see what kind of effect we're seeing. But I would say it's probably close to like 50% of the factories that our members are working in that are now compliant. So that's very exciting.
And that's to contrast, just for those of you who are covering this issue for the first time, like in LA factories, I believe the average wage before SB 62 was under $6 an hour, and there were sometimes wages as low as $2.77 an hour. So bringing workers up to the minimum wage really does make a huge difference. And then the other thing, Francisco in particular, talking to you throughout the process of SB 62 was really watching the Garment Workers Center and garment workers and women and immigrants and people of color who are typically completely left out of the political process, taken seriously by, the governor of California. And now we have a US Senator really championing this cause of working people. So for Francisco, I want to hear from you, like, how has SB 62 impacted your life and other members that in Garment Workers Center, and what would it mean for you if the Fabric Act were to pass on the federal level?
Well, I would like to answer that question in English. First of all, we are really pleased to know that people from all over the country are looking at us like an example, like a good example, because this the SB 62 was passed by honestly just a reduced group of people who we organized ourselves and we fought shoulder to shoulder. But let me tell you, it was really like an uphill fight, an uphill situation, because we knew exactly who we were, who and what we were fighting against. It wasn't easy, and that's what I would like to suggest. The people who are looking at SB 62 as a good example, and thank you for that. And I wish that all my co-workers could have. I wish I could have a monument in Los Angeles, a big monument with the names of those people who helped us to get through this, and then make a big monument with everyone's name on it with capital letters. And because now we realize that our efforts and our work to pass the SB 62 is more than just a law that helps Californians, but not only in the United States, but abroad. And so what it means, yeah, what that is going to affect me, the way that affects me, if this law, like the Fabric Act will pass, it means that if I don't, for any reasons, I can find work in Los Angeles or in California, I can go to another place and I will be able to get better salary in at another state. Because just to make very quick, I just want to mention there are some contractors who are taking they are taking work from Los Angeles to the state of Nevada, for instance. But we already know that the state of Nevada pays lower price in questions of like the minimum wage. So if this law becomes like a federal law, it will help a lot, and it will help me to not not to think not to have this problem what we have here in Los Angeles, because this is not only in Los Angeles. I'm glad to know that this law is becoming a very important issue, not only in the United States but around the world, because there are so many things that are going on, and it's still, it's still the bad work conditions are still out there.
Thank you, Francisco. And yes, to your point, someone in the chat just mentioned that she's heard that of garment workers, even in New York City, making $5 a day. I see a question, Edgar, and maybe before you hop off, Edgar has to leave soon. So if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat very quickly because he needs to go. Will the bill address safety issues in factories?
So could you repeat that, Elizabeth?
Will the bill address safety issues in factories?
I think the bill does a number of things, okay? One of the things too, and which we haven't talked a lot about, but I think that's important, and that's the whole issue of piece rates. Let me just start there for a moment. Okay, what the bill does is prohibit payment of piece rates, okay, where workers in shops are not making minimum wage or where there's a union collective bargaining agreement. Piece rates are interesting in the sense that they can be very good or they can be very bad. They could be very good in the sense where you have a process to set a piece rate that yields a decent wage, not only the minimum wage, but yields a living wage where somebody could be able to, to earn a decent living as a result of the work that they perform. The problem in the non-union environment, okay, is that the employer sets the piece rate, and usually it's set very low, okay, not even to make the minimum wage in most communities. All right, as opposed to where, so that's a bad situation, and there's no recourse, and either you accept it or you don't. Okay, and this bill I think will provide, will stop that, and it make sure that people do at least get what the minimum wage is in that community, as opposed to when you say, well, what. If you ask the question, well, what good is a piece rate? A piece rate is good when people, because it's an incentive basically. So when you have an environment where you have the employer, the worker, and the union able to sit down and to set that piece rate to yield, okay, a wage, okay, that is beyond, is a living wage, certainly, and in many, many cases beyond, it can work. And when there is a remediation, if there is a dispute about that piece rate, okay, where it can go, that's what is involved in a union environment. And that's basically the arbitration. So that's where it certainly can work well. In terms of the other areas, okay, and health and safety that you mentioned, all right, the bill is going to address those issues, okay? Employers are going to have to make sure that their companies and firms where their workers are employed at conform to certain health and safety regulations. Now, the key to all of this really is how do we monitor this? A bill is great if it's on paper, okay, but if it's not monitored, and we have an industry, obviously, that is largely made up of immigrants today. All right. And many of those immigrants are concerned and afraid to speak up for a whole host of reasons, not only about losing their job, but in some cases, even getting, perhaps deported, back to their countries. So it's going to have, I think, if the bill is going to be successful and achieve the results, okay, and the goals and aspirations, okay, we're going to have to make sure that that bill certainly isn't not only passed, because that might be the easier piece, quite frankly, but actually to make sure once the bill is passed, that is enforced and that the mechanisms are in place to be able to assure workers that if they do come forward to make complaints, okay, that there won't be reprisals or recriminations as a result of what they do.
Thank you so much, Edgar, and thank you for being here with us. I know you have to
Okay,
run.
and I'm
so
sorry I
you.
can't stay longer, but good luck and let's work to get this bill passed. Okay? Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Take
All right.
care. So we are the rest of us are gonna stay on and answer some more questions. I did want to add to this question about safety. The grant program, one of the things pieces of work that money is set aside for is for safety improvement. So if factories want to use it to for safety training or equipment, that $40 million grant program does stipulate that safety is one of the things that manufacturers are encouraged to use the money for. And to Edgar's point, I also think that what we've seen in fashion supply chains is, again, that oftentimes workplace safety problems, they start from the top of the supply chain. They start from this, really hyper competitive environment that the big brands in particular create. So in California, but we've also seen this in Bangladesh and really all over the world, that brands are often underpaying their factories for products, and the factory can't afford proper workplace safety equipment. So that's why the increased accountability on fashion brands and retailers is such an important part of the Fabric Act. Okay, so we have another question from Business and Fashion. So this is a question about the process. What is the timeline for the Fabric Act? When do we think we're going to get it signed into law? What are the key dates and deadlines that we should be watching out for? And are those involved in authoring and sponsoring braced for pushback or amendments from less supportive lawmakers as it progresses? I can answer part of that, and then Daisy, if you want to hop in and add anything. This is a new process for this coalition. We worked on this bill on the state level, so it is a learning. To be honest, it's a learning process for all of us. We are heartened because the bill has already picked up 3 co-sponsors. We have Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Cory Booker, who have already signed on. The most important first step is to pick up more sponsors. In particular, we need bipartisan support, and we expect that the bill will garner bipartisan support, but that really is the most important first part of the process, and it's really key to getting the bill moving. And in terms of pushback or amendments from less supportive lawmakers as it progresses, I don't necessarily know the answer to that, but the thing for our group that we really are, the bottom line for us is really making sure that the bill preserves joint and several liability on fashion brands for wage theft. As Edgar explained so eloquently, that really is the precedent-setting part of this bill, and we really think is the most important piece for changing the business model in fashion, so we don't keep having these conversations every year about why there's wage theft and why there's poverty pay in a $3 trillion industry. Daisy, was there anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, not on that point.
Okay. So what are some of the consequences? This is another question from press. What are some of the consequences brands will face when they refuse to comply with the Fabric Act? Actually, Daisy, would you mind answering that? Because maybe it would be helpful to explain, what happens in California now if a worker suffers wage theft. Like, what are the kind of steps of recourse that they have available to them?
Sure. So again, the Fabric Act is mirroring SB 62, and what we were able to gain in SB 62 is up the chain citations. So traditionally, since the last, laws were passed to protect garment workers in California in 1999, citations were only issued to the direct employer and to a manufacturer. But brands, constantly really wash their hands of the problem of wage theft in their supply chains. And so with the Fabric Act, we're ensuring accountability throughout the entire supply chain. The same thing would happen with citations, and all parties in that supply chain would be liable for the wage theft that a worker endured. Another thing that, two other things that can happen. One is, if a factory or a manufacturer is not complying, there can be a revocation of the registration. And with the Fabric Act, I believe, we're introducing a registration component, nationally. And another thing that can happen here in California is that goods that were produced under these sweatshop conditions can actually be confiscated, which is another tool to really ensure that that there is, I guess, auditing of the supply chain, ensuring that workers are making a minimum wage throughout it.
Thank you. And there's another question that maybe Daisy or Francisco, you might know the answer to. So how will the Fabric Act create a safe space for garment workers to advocate for their rights? We talked about this fear of retaliation that can happen, and I know that Garment Workers Center, that's a big part of what y'all do is helping people understand their rights. But if you could just talk through how you're thinking about that, this idea of creating safety around speaking up.
Sure. I think with the campaign to pass SB 62 over the last 2 years, a big part of this was, bringing to the light this industry, right? There are, an estimated 95,000 workers throughout the United States that are, involved in the garment industry. And many people think that, this is an industry that no longer exists here. It's an industry, or these are the issues that we're talking about today are, issues that wouldn't happen in the United States, that only happen abroad, right? And so a lot of this work has been, bringing these workers, I think, out of like the shadows, right? And pushing the public to really think about, where your clothes is made, how it was made, and who made it. And for workers, I think that has brought out just the need to feel more empowered and to be seen. And I think that that's the first step for workers to begin to exercise their rights and to know what rights they have. I think this is especially important because throughout the pandemic, many garment workers went from producers of clothes, of the latest trends, to essential workers, right? And throughout California, factories from overnight went into producing PPE. So they were sewing masks, hospital gowns, and that were so essential to getting us through the pandemic. And so we've really just focused on communicating to garment workers, as an essential worker, do you feel you deserve better pay, better working conditions, better treatment? And that is what really propelled workers to push for SB 62, and how we start these conversations with workers that you do have rights and you can demand better pay, better treatment. And we make sure that workers know what steps they can take to reclaim stolen wages, and that's what we're hoping to do at a national level as well.
Okay, and Francisco, jump in if you want to answer any of these. So there's another question about, do we expect there to be bipartisan support for the bill? I don't want to speculate who might sign on, but there has been some interest on the Republican side. I'm sorry. So but that said, I don't think it's going to fall in our laps. And the reason is just because there's so much going on in Congress right now. So, it really is a priority for this coalition to start doing outreach to see who might be a good ally in getting the Fabric Act passed, because, we do think that it has a lot of potential to garner support on both sides of the aisle. So that's certainly going to be an area of focus for us. So another question, does the bill have a federal minimum wage for garment workers regardless of the state? My understanding is that because it's amending the Fair Labor Standards Act, the federal minimum wage would be the floor, and then the state law, like California, for example. Daisy, you're shaking your head yes. If you want to jump in and answer this, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding as well is that the federal minimum wage would apply to states that don't have laws that override the federal minimum wage and provide an increased minimum wage. In California, that's the case, where our minimum wage laws override the federal, but in other states, it would be following the same federal minimum wage regulations.
Okay, the next question is, how will the Fabric Act enable freedom of association and collective bargaining in the US context when there's so much resistance from the business community? Of course, Edgar would be a great person to answer this question. But I have some thoughts. I do think that, what we heard time and again working on SB 62 is just this idea that that sweatshop producers and brands and manufacturers that were operating by exploiting their workforce, were making it hard for people to produce and compete in the United States. And so what we would hear from brands who wanted to produce more in the United States was that it felt risky to them. They were worried about reputational damage. What if they were producing in a factory and it turned out that their garment workers were not even being paid a minimum wage? So for them, for a lot of brands, we just kept hearing that, if we could create a floor for workplace standards, that it would really encourage them and incentivize them to produce more here. So the idea behind the bill and the reason why, it has these incentives combined with workplace protections is we really do feel like it's the perfect moment in time to start expanding domestic production and really cementing the US as this hub of ethical and sustainable garment manufacturing. And in terms of organized labor, I think that if we can create this floor that cultivates, a better environment for freedom of association and collective bargaining, I think that it can only mean good things for organizing. Daisy, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think, I'll just share that, again, the Fabric Act is, mirroring SB 62, and what we're including in the Fabric Act as well is just like a, I guess, like carve out, right, for businesses that do have a collective bargaining agreement. There's still an ability to pay a piece rate there where, and as Edgar mentioned, workers have, the power, right, the collective power to negotiate those rates to ensure that they, reflect their hours worked and their level of production.
Okay, and then, we'll have this be the last question. And then if Daisy and Francisco, if you want to add any final thoughts. We had a question, if the Biden administration drops the Chinese tariffs, how will this affect the Fabric Act? I may be misinterpreting the question, but I don't think that it would affect the Fabric Act. And there's a few reasons. One of the things is we're seeing reshoring and a growth in domestic manufacturing for a confluence of reasons. It's not just because of tariffs or increasing labor costs in China. It's because companies want better control over their supply chain. They want faster turnaround. And to be honest, the US is manufacturing, for the most part, a very different kind of apparel product than what we see being made in China. Just to name an example, when we were at Ferrara Manufacturing on Friday, you know, they're making the most skilled tailor garments that you can find almost anywhere in the world. So they've really specialized in a kind of product that is difficult to find in other places. But I also am happy to take that question back to Gillibrand staff if you want a more detailed response. And okay, one other question from Katie at the New York Times. Can you elaborate a little bit on some of the specific impacts that you've noticed in factories in California that are now compliant with SB 62? Are there specific states other than California where your research indicates wage theft is a significant issue? I can take the second part of that. From what we've seen, wage theft is happening, unfortunately, in every state where there is garment manufacturing in the US, and I'm happy to pass the most recent research on that. It's a problem in Texas. We've seen it in Massachusetts. Someone just mentioned there are factories in New York where this is an issue. And of course, it's a problem in California. So unfortunately, it's sort of endemic and found everywhere that there is garment manufacturing. Daisy, do you want to talk more about the specific impacts that you've noticed in factories in California that are now compliant with SB 62?
Sure. I don't know what else to add. Yeah, we, since January 1st have, heard more and more from workers that employers are moving away from the piece rate and providing a weekly salary that includes the minimum wage requirements, right? So they're now making twice as much as workers used to under the piece rate. We are hearing in some factories that there's still more work to do around overtime pay, but also hearing from our membership that some factories are just not complying at all. We're hearing that some factories are trying to operate behind closed doors to avoid any enforcement. So that's why we're really doubling down on our outreach efforts to workers to be able to inform us and the state labor commissioner's office of where these factories are that are refusing to comply. Yeah, I think that's all I can add.
Yeah, and I would just add, with wage theft, and Francisco, you're such a great example of this. If it's happening to just one person, it's too many people. Francisco, for example, can share the reality of working 60-hour weeks for $260, and what that means for communities when you're not able to afford to pay your rent, to put your kids through school, to buy healthy food. So for us, I think in this coalition, if wage theft is happening anywhere in the United States, in any garment factory, it's just inexcusable. It's something we really just shouldn't stand for. So we are going to leave it there. If we didn't get to your questions, please reach out to us. We're happy to follow up over email. And the next steps for the Fabric Act are continuing to get endorsements from labor, industry, civil society, educational institutions. If you know someone who wants to endorse, please reach out to us. And then we are asking the public to please call your US Senator and ask them to co-sponsor and support the Fabric Act. I want to thank Garment Workers Center. Daisy, thank you for being here. Francisco, thank you so much for your time as well. To Edgar and Workers United, who was with us earlier, and to all of the press and all of the allies that are here to listen to this conversation today. Thank you for your time. And this is just the beginning of the journey with the Fabric Act. So yeah, more soon, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.